Hello and welcome to a new episode of Josh's Car Corner and the next part of Project Crewman, which is going to be the completion of the engine that I started in the previous episode. Now you're probably going to see some wardrobe changes during the course of this video. It didn't all get filmed in one day, but we're going to go right on to where I left off on the last episode, the installation of the cylinder heads. Okay, it is time for another big milestone in putting this engine back together, and that is to put the cylinder heads back on. But before I can do that, I have to put my new lifters in. So I've got 4 new lifter trays from Michigan Motorsports, and I've got a new complete set of LS7 lifters. Being a stock engine, this is going to be perfectly acceptable for the application. So they've been soaking in oil for at least 24 hours. So I'm just going to grab them out here with my magnet, and then I'm going to load them into the tray here. It's important to soak them for 24 hours because that will push all of the air out of them and they'll fill them with nothing but oil. So then pumping them up when it comes for your initial fire up will take a lot less time. And it just makes sure everything is nice and lubricated within the lifter. Now on these LS7 lifters, they've got an oil hole in them, right? Right here on one side, and only one side. So what I do is I always have my oil holes pointing toward the front of the motor. It just keeps everything nice and uniform, and I was told a long time ago, when you're installing these lifters, that is the way you want to do it. So I'm just getting this first one installed here, and they are a little stiff, but this thing will hold them just fine. Okay, got all 4 lifters installed. All 4 oil holes are pointing toward the front. All you have to do is just go over here and you gently walk this back and forth, and eventually all the lifters will find their home, and then this pushes all 4 of them down at once. And you just, once you do that, you just evenly, gently slide it down. Then you can install your bolt to hold it. Now, if you get replacement ones for these, that's good. Just make sure they've got a nice wide washer on them. This hole on this is pretty big, and you want to make sure you've got good contact on this thing to hold it down. It only requires 106 inch-pounds, not foot-pounds, inch-pounds. I got that one in. I'm just going to put the rest of them together, and then I'll break out the torque wrench. Okay, that is done. So I'm going to go get some brake cleaner and a fresh towel. I'm going to wipe these mating surfaces off, and then it's going to be time to put on the cylinder heads. So when I got these 243 heads with this engine block, I knew I needed to get them rebuilt and make sure that everything was good about them. So I found this guy on one of the GTO Facebook groups named Oliver Newell. He lives in Grand Blanc, Michigan. He said he's rebuilding LS cylinder heads, and he offered me a price for these, so I sent them up to him, and he rebuilt them for me with LS3 springs, and I have not seen these since I got them back a few months ago. So I am excited to dig these out and see what these refurbished 243 heads look like. Okay, we've got a little description of work here. Let's see what he wrote. 243 cylinder head reconditioned full, 3-angle valve job, pressure check, deck sandblast all valve cylinder heads, Mil 5000s, LS3 spring upgrade, and a Gen 3 valley cover, which is awesome. I needed a valley cover. Let's take a look. All right, this is this is a front engine cover. That isn't what I wanted, but that's okay. That's no big deal, I'll sell it. All right, so here is one of the cylinder heads right here. Let's get this baby uncovered. All right, here we go. There's some still work of the porting process in here, some little shards of aluminum, but that does look nice. Okay, and here are the top end with the LS3 springs. Yeah, that looks really good. And LS3 springs are pretty much the same as LS2 springs. They might be just a tiny bit stiffer, but not enough to be concerned about. And considering the application, these are gonna work great. So I'm very excited. They look very good inside, very clean. It's not glass smooth, but you know what? I could definitely see where he's done some work with a grinder and opened these up a little bit. And the 3-angle valve job, that will improve airflow, even though I don't need any more power. That's probably gonna give me a couple extra ponies, but that is exciting. So I'm just gonna make sure I get this all blown clean. So I'm gonna get my air chuck out and just blow these off before I put them on. But this is exciting. And if you've got a set of LS heads that you need to have reconditioned, I can attest this guy does good work. So reach out to Oliver Newell, Grand Blanc, Michigan. I think his company is Neps Automotive. That's what it says on here. So yeah, you could reach out to him if you need some heads rebuilt for yourself. Okay, I've already got one cylinder head fully bolted on and torqued down. Now I'm working on the other one. So, well, I just want to show you one thing about the head gaskets here. So these are Fel-Pros, but if it was a factory GM one, it would say front on one side, but not on the other. The thing to remember about these is whatever it says front, that needs to go to the front. So even on a factory gasket, if you have to turn it upside down, so this is at the front, you put it at the front. Why? You would think this head gasket is exactly the same, but the difference is right in this corner right here. This is coolant passages that are supposed to be open on the back of the block, and if you put this thing on backwards and have these passages open up but these ones shut, you won't have correct water flow through your engine and you'll overheat and you'll have all kinds of problems. So you always need to make sure front is front. It's more important than you being able to see the writing. Well, it has been a minute since I have been working on this engine, but as you can see now, both of the heads are bolted on. Now, this is something I've done before in previous videos. If you want to see the torquing procedure for how to put these down, go watch episode 26 of Josh's Car Corner, where Joe and I swapped the new cam into his GXP. I also have a new Valley cover pan installed, and unfortunately, it's really hard to get the ones these days that have the port right here for the vent, like a GTO would have. So this one's just a flat cover, and instead I'm gonna have to draw my vacuum out of the crankcase through the valve covers. I've got some truck valve covers, and I'm probably gonna make a system where I'm gonna tee them together to have a common feed into the intake manifold when all is said and done. The one thing I just got done doing here is changing all of the trunnions in these rockers to brand new trunnions that are upgraded so they can't escape. This is something everyone's probably heard about before, but I'm just gonna go through it. So the factory trunnions in these things are not retained. So they're pressed in and they're full of needle bearings, but once you get spinning an engine really high RPM, because they're not retained, the caps that hold the needles in can pop out, and if they pop out, needles go into your engine and it's an absolute disaster. So this upgrade kit actually replaces these caps, so it's still needle bearings inside, but they are retained by little snap rings. You can see that right there. So the caps cannot pop out. So this is just a nice upgrade, and it gives you a nice new bolt too to use that uses an Allen head as opposed to a hex head. Now I did this myself, which that's the first time I've ever done that before, and it was actually a really fun experience to go through and pop them out and pop new ones in and make these rockers new again. The way I did it was I went to Harbor Freight and I got what's called a 1-ton arbor press, and it's just a hand-controlled thing. It's all mechanical, no hydraulics, and you just set these things in here and you crank it down and it pops the old bearings out, and then you use it again with some spacer washers and you pop the new caps on and a new trunnion in. It's a really cool procedure, but Brian Tooley Racing actually did a much better video showing how to do it, so I'm just going to put a link in the upper right hand corner right here to Brian Tooley's video so you can see how to do it with that Harbor Freight arbor press, so you can replicate what I did. I've got some brand new push rods, and these are just factory 7400. Normally, if I was building an engine, I would take the time to actually measure out my preload on my lifters, but because this is all factory components and there's nothing crazy going on here, it's a factory cam with a factory diameter on the journals, I don't have to worry about things being too small, things being too tall. The heads have been decked 5,000s, and that I'm using Fel-Pro head gaskets, and those are a 48 thousandths installed height versus the factory, which is a 51 thousandths installed height, so they're 3 thousandths shorter, plus 5 thousandths, it's 8 thousandths shorter. That is still within tolerance of the factory LS7 lifters that are in this thing, so I don't need to measure anything, they're gonna be fine. The only thing I gotta do is, when I install them, assembly lube again on both ends of the push rods and also on the tips of the rockers here. Also some assembly lube on the tips of the rocker arms and also on the cup here that holds the push rod in place. So I'm gonna go ahead and start getting these installed. Okay, there we go. All right, now it is time to put this rocker pedestal on. Okay, just get that started. So now the way to tighten these rocker arms down is to do them when the cylinders are at top dead center. So the way this works is you've got a firing order on an LS, right? It goes 1, 8, 7, 2, 6, 5, 4, 3. So you have companion cylinders going on. So you've always got two cylinders doing the same thing at the same time. And they're always 5 cylinders apart in the firing order. So whatever 1 is doing, 6 is doing. Whatever 8 is doing, 5 is doing. Whatever 7 is doing, 4 is doing. And whatever 3 is doing, and 2 is doing the same thing. Companion cylinders, right? So that means I can tighten down the rocker arms on companion cylinders at the same time. And once that's done, turn the motor 90 degrees and then go on to the next set of companion cylinders. And then once those are tightened down, repeat, do it again, repeat. And then instead of turning the motor over 8 times, you only have to turn the motor over 4 times. So I'm gonna get started doing that. Get all of the bolts started, and you want to make sure the pedestal is nice and lined up before you start torquing these down. The only thing is you have to remember that some cylinders are gonna be being pushed down right now. So when you tighten these down, you just have to make sure that the push rods are resting in the cups. And it's best to start by doing this by hand, because the other thing you wanna do is make sure that the tip of the rocker arm is right on the middle of the valve stem. You don't want it off to the side. You wanna make sure it's centered when you torque it down. Okay, time to torque down these rocker arms. Now, let's get one thing straight about these bolts. Preload is not determined by the bolts that hold these rocker arms down. Preload is determined by the length of the push rod and how far it pushes the cup on the lifter in when it's installed. So if you need more preload or less preload, you change the length of that push rod. You do not change the torque specs on these bolts. These are always 22 foot-pounds no matter what you do. Okay, now get my big 24 out. Now we're gonna spin the motor 90 degrees. That's about straight up. Okay, so now we're gonna move on to cylinder number 8 and cylinder number 5. Okay, 8 and 5 are done. Turn the motor over another 90 degrees. Okay, it's time for 7 and 4. Okay, and the last ones. Will be 2 and 3. Okay. One more time around to get back to TDC. There we go. Valvetrain installed. Now I can put these valve covers on and finally button up the top of this engine. And with the exception of the spark plug holes, this thing will finally be all sealed up. Well, as you can see, I've got the water pump installed and then this tensioner pulley too. And I also put the little bracket on for the power steering fluid reservoir. One of the biggest scores I got when I started building this engine was there was a guy who has a GTO and he converted his front accessory drive to CTSV stuff because he's running a CTSV blower. So he had for sale his complete front accessory drive. So this was a huge score. At $750, it was worth twice the price. All this stuff is in like really low mileage, good shape too. Got a new AC compressor, lovely. Also have the aforementioned power steering pump. This is a little used, but it'll clean up nice. Also got the AC bracket and the 2 tensioners that ride on it. This doohickey right here is the actual aluminum body that the power steering pump bolts to. It sits in here somewhere. I gotta remember how that goes on. Let's see, this is an alternator bracket. This is for the back of the alternator. And last but not least is the alternator itself and the front mount bracket for it with the other idler pulley. So first thing I'm gonna put on is the harmonic balancer itself. You actually need a special tool for this. I could have gone to O'Reilly's and gotten one, but I thought to myself, you know, I'm probably gonna pull a harmonic balancer and put a new one on at some point in my life. So I actually got this on Amazon for 15 bucks, and this will only install a harmonic balancer, but it'll work real nice. What you get is a long threaded rod that goes in, and it's got a hex on it so you can tighten it in. You're gonna we thread this into the crank like this, and then when it bottoms out, we don't have to really torque it down. We just have to bottom it out in there. Then you use a series of heavy duty washers, and this one even comes with a bearing that you press against with those washers. And then the key to it is a nut with a lot of threads in it. I can look inside, and this has got like 7 threads in it. You need a lot of thread engagement to drive home this harmonic balancer. So I'm gonna get this all set up, and I think I'm gonna use some of this ARP lubricant too, just to give everything a lot of lubricity while I'm torquing on it. So I'm gonna get this set up. Okay, so the threaded rod is now all the way in there, fully bottomed out. The order of this seems to be the 2 big thick washers go on first, then the bearing goes on to press on those, and then we've got the giant 24mm nut. And I did put the ARP thread lube on the whole run of this shank, so there'll be good lubrication here, and I put some on the face of this nut so it gives a little lubrication against the bearing. So the other key to this is you have to make sure the engine can't spin over. So you have to actually get a ring gear locking tool, which I have one from working on the GTO years ago. It bolts on in the location of the starter. It just goes into the 2 starter holes, and then it's got teeth that engage the ring gear. So now that the ring gear is on there, I can lock the crank in place, and now I can actually put this on. So basically, when the nut gets tight and you don't see this thing sliding back anymore, you're fully engaged. So I'm gonna get started. I think we're almost there. Doesn't want to turn much more. Okay, yeah, I just felt the ring gear tool engage. Okay, now we're turning the whole motor on the stand. Yeah, I don't think this is going anymore. I think we're there. I'm gonna just lean into the... Yep, that is all the way on for sure. Okay, so I was sitting here looking at this, and this pulley just didn't look like it was far enough back to me. Something didn't look right. There's marks, and it just looked like it was a little farther forward than it should be. And even trying to sit here line it up with the alternator, it looked like it was a little farther forward. I put this on here just to mock it up and compare. But then I went and grabbed the trusty old straight edge, put it right up against the harmonic balancer, and put it on the alternator pulley, and it lines up perfectly. It's not off, it's not forward, it's not backward. It's touching here, here, and here, so it has to be lined up. Since I've already got the alternator on there, I'm gonna put the back bracket on, then I'll give you the torque specs for all these bolts, and we'll just start putting things on. If you read the service manual, it says all of these bolts get 37 foot-pounds. You've got 2 here holding the alternator, there's another one back here on the support bracket, and then there's 2 going into the block here. But here's the thing. I think the service manual has an error in it. And by the way, I have found multiple errors in the service manual over the years of working on the GTO and the Crewman. It says all bolts get 37 foot-pounds, but the 2 in the back here going to the back of this bracket are M8 bolts. Everything else is a big M10 bolt. And anywhere else you look in the service manual, an M10 bolt does get 37 foot-pounds, but anytime there's an M8 bolt anywhere going into the block, it only takes 18 foot-pounds. Now, I have made the mistake in the past on the GTO of trying to torque these 2 little bolts on the bracket to 37 foot-pounds and felt like I was rounding out the threads in the block because I think it's too much torque. I think that's a misprint. I think, for safety's sake, these back bolts should only get 18 foot-pounds. They're the same size as the bolts for the oil pan and the water pump and everything else. They shouldn't be getting 37 foot-pounds. So, personal opinion, those 2 back bracket bolts should only be getting 18 foot-pounds. Okay, well, I turned them up to 24 because I realized the oil pan bolts are M6 bolts. These are M6 bolts. These are M8 bolts. They probably need more torque, but they definitely don't need 37. I would recommend you do not try to torque these bracket bolts to 37. Anyway, if everything is torqued properly, this should still spin freely. If you have something over torqued or something is cocked, the alternator won't spin because the whole body of the alternator is being torqued and it won't allow the rod to spin freely. But this is spinning nice and free. This is done. So I'm gonna move on to power steering pump. First I gotta get this plate on that holds the pump. Okay, I have got the power steering bracket in place now. Ready for some more weird numbers? So if you look at the service manual, it wants for these bolts, these M10 bolts, 21 foot-pounds. Now that seems like no big deal to me. I can gladly put on these 21 foot-pounds. The other problem becomes with the bolts for the pump itself. So these are smaller. These are M8. It also wants these to have 21 foot-pounds, and this is aluminum. They're going into here, and to be honest, I have tried that torque spec on the GTO power steering pump bracket before and felt like I was pulling threads. So I am not gonna do that. What I'm gonna do instead is use 18 foot-pounds, a torque spec that I trust a lot more for bolts of this size, and I'm just gonna put some red Loctite on them to hold them. And you just gotta have the pulley turn the right way so you can get these bolts lined up. Then I can take a socket here and get them started. Okay, now I'm only gonna do 18 foot-pounds. Anyway, I feel much more comfortable with that torque spec, so alternator's on, power steering pulley is on. Next thing I'm gonna probably do is start putting the air conditioning bracket on. Okay, I am back in the garage. It has been a long month of September, but I'm finally through it. And as you can see, a lot has happened to the engine since the last time I recorded anything. What I'm doing right now is I gotta put the engine back on the ground. There are a couple of bolts that require a lot of torque that I need to tighten, one of them being the bolt for the Harmonic Balancer. So I put the feet back on. I also have a new flex plate, and I've got to tighten those bolts down, and unfortunately the brace that is holding the engine to the engine stand is in the way of that. So I'm going to be using something I never used before, and I'm kind of glad I found this. This is an engine lift plate, and this is made by a company called GSI down in Chandler, Arizona. They do a lot of old classic Chevy truck parts, but they also make these for if you want to do an LS swap and you just want an easy way to lift an engine into a truck. So it's got 5 different holes in it that I can attach the hook from my engine lift into. And the great thing is it's going to be centered side to side in terms of load balance. The front to rear may be a little off, but I just change the position of the hole and I can change the tilt. So it's a great way to do it. It's certainly better than trying to use these ears, which is what I've always done in the past. These are not very strong, and I found that with a fully dressed engine, this one tends to bend quite a bit. It just can't handle the weight of all of this. So this is gonna be nice. I'm gonna get the engine down on the ground, and I will start to get these other bolts tightened up. Okay, got the engine on the ground, got my breaker bar on here. So this bolt for the Harmonic Balancer is supposed to take 240 foot-pounds. I have never seen a torque wrench that can go above 200, so I think there's no point even trying to get the torque exact on this thing. Now, factory bolts come with a little bit of Loctite on them. If you're using a bolt that doesn't have Loctite, put some on there because there's gonna be a lot of harmonic resonance here and this is gonna wanna try to back out. But in terms of just getting it on, 240 foot-pounds, the best thing I can say is get it on there and just give it hell. So I'm gonna torque it down as tight as I can by hand. Then I think I'm gonna stand on it to make sure I get enough, or I'm just gonna put all my weight into it. All right, a little bit of this. It is torque to yield, so that should be enough to hold it. So I'll get her spun around here, and I will get these bolts on for the flex plate. Okay, here I am with the back of the engine. This is my brand new flex plate. This flex plate is off a Pontiac G8, and this is the one I wanted to use because I'm going to be bolting it to a 6L80 out of a G8, and I'm also going to be using the starter out of a G8. So everything will match up as far as distance-wise for the ring gear to the starter, engagement gear, and all that stuff. Here's the little tool I have. Like I said, bolts to the 2 starter holes, and it's engaging the teeth, stops everything from turning. Whether you have a clutch or a flex plate, these bolts get torqued the same way to the same amount of foot-pounds. 3 passes, you go 15 on the first, then 36 on the second, and then 74 on the final pass. And there is a torquing order to this. You got a pilot hole right here between these 2 bolts. This is where you start. This is number 1. They want you to do 2 triangles. So you're gonna go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'll do them at the 3 torquing stages and get this guy torqued down. Okay, there we go. Now I can take this little stopper off and I can put the starter on there. And once that's done, I'm gonna put that thing back on the back of the block and get the engine back on the engine stand. Okay, engine is back on the engine stand. I've also got the factory engine mounts put back on here. I did use new bolt hardware that's actually a little longer. The factory bolt hardware doesn't go in as deep as new hardware can go in. You can actually get bolts that are a few millimeters longer, which I recommend because you got to put so much torque on these, and aluminum does not like to be reused when it comes to threads. I actually had to retap a couple of these because they were a little tight with bolts going in. So these get 36 foot-pounds. That's all done. Same thing's going to apply here to the exhaust. So for this engine, for the time being anyway, I am going to use factory cast iron log manifolds. And the thing I have experienced in the past with the GTO is these bolt holes for the exhaust manifold. These are M8 bolts, and this is one of the places the cylinder head gets the hottest. So this is one of the places where the aluminum also gets the softest and goes through the most heat cycles, which, if you know anything about metal, constant repetitive heat cycles do eventually weaken metal. And I have had problems with putting normal bolts in here after taking a header off and putting them back on, and these threads starting to strip out. And because I do not want to strip out 3 cylinder heads and have to retap them, I always use, when I'm replacing those bolts, studs. And fortunately, there's a company now called 269 Motorsports that makes a very inexpensive stud kit. You can get them through Michigan Motorsports. So what it is you've got studs with a 4mm Allen head on them here. You just thread them in and give them just a couple of pound-feet to hold them in place. Then you can put the manifold on, and then you can use nuts instead of trying to drive home bolts. And you can put just as much torque on these, but because these are turning against the studs, you're not putting the stress on the threads in the head. So this is the way I like to go. So these get 32 foot-pounds. And for this application, I'm just using Fel-Pro gaskets, which are not multi-layer steel like the factory gaskets are. They're actually got a kind of a material on them, a composite material, just to give some more thickness and a little more flexibility, because there's no guarantee that this log manifold has a flat surface on it anymore. There's no guarantee this head has a flat surface on it anymore. So this kind of gasket will just fill up the spaces in between where it might be a little low and a little high, so I get a nice tight seal. Torquing pattern for this, because I'm working with a soft manifold gasket, is going to be to work from the center out. So these two middle ones, outer ones. And I'm going to start with a little bit of torque and then work my way up to my 32 foot-pounds. Okay, as you can see, I am back here with the engine. I've got a lot more things done now. I've got the exhaust manifolds attached on both sides. What you will see now is I took the alternator back off because I'm going to do something that I've actually never done on an engine build before, that I'm going to prime the engine. So you might recognize this guy from previous episodes. This is a Motive power bleeder. In the past, I have always used one of these to bleed brake systems, but it can do a lot of different things. I've got a little fitting here. This is an oil passage hole right here on this corner of the block, and you can see the oil channel right here. You get a little barb fitting and some hose. You just fill it up. It holds 3 quarts, and I'm just going to pump it up to 30 pounds, and I'm going to let it push oil throughout the entire system. And I'll start seeing it come out the rocker tips up here, and once it gets that high, I know I'm in good shape. Then I'm just going to keep rotating the motor 90 degrees at a time until I see it coming out of all of the rocker tips. And once it's coming out of all the rocker tips, then I know that the entire oil system is full of oil and it's going to be ready to go for the first fire. Now, if you're going to do this, you have to make sure you've got the entire engine sealed up for oil. So it's got an oil filter on it that's filled to the top with oil. The valley cover is installed because the oil pressure gauge is there. That hole needs to be sealed up. So now that that's done, I can start to pump this thing up, and it is going to start to force oil into the engine. And because this vessel is completely full of oil, it is not going to take long to build up the pressure. Already at 25 PSI. I'm going to take it right up to 30 because it'll just helps the oil get into the system a lot faster. All right, almost there. I think it's moving oil pretty quickly here because I'm having to keep pumping it just to maintain or get close to 30. Well, I'll keep working on this. Oh yeah, and I can see the level's already starting to go down. Well, I'll let this go for a little while and see how long it takes the pressure to bleed off. Well, it's bleeding off really quickly. Okay, already down below 25. Oh, I can see it working its way through passages because the needle all of a sudden jumps and then stops moving. So while this is happening, I am going to start to slowly crank the motor over too, but I'm just going to keep at this, keep the pressure up, and let this thing do its job. I'm hearing all kinds of little pops and fizzes from the Valvetrain. I'm going to take the mic off, see if you can hear these. You hear that? That's the oil gurgling. Oh, it's really happening on number 7. I think I'm going to spin the motor over another 90. Oh, there we go. Got oil right there coming out of the rocker for number 1. That is the intake rocker. Now there are oil pressure vessels out there that are built for purpose for priming an LS engine, and on those you can usually get up to 50, 60 PSI of pressure. So those will get the job done faster than this will, but because this is what I have and it does get the job done with a little more time involved, it is still a good way to go. What I'm using to do this is Driven racing oil. It's a break-in motor oil made by Joe Gibbs Racing. Now a lot of people will say that when you want to break in an engine that you put completely back together, you want to use a oil with a high zinc content. A lot of people go for Shell Rotella. That's got a high zinc content compared to most other motor oils. This has got a ridiculously high zinc content. It's designed just for breaking in an engine. So you basically run this stuff for a half hour, it breaks everything in, and then you change it out for a normal oil. What this is specifically doing that I'm concerned about is it's helping those rings seat to the bores and be nice and smooth and break in really nicely. I don't have to worry so much about the camshaft and the lifters. That cam's already been run, and the lifters, because they got roller tips, they don't really have to break in. It's really just the rings, but I want them to have a nice tight seal. And spending on a little more on this oil than just going to a Rotella, in this particular case, because I built this engine myself and I really want it to work well, I thought, what the heck, let's go for it. It is dripping just the littlest bit out of here. I probably should have put a hose clamp on there, but the guy saw do this. He didn't put a hose clamp on his. I'm actually gonna put a link to his video in the upper right-hand corner right here. He normally does motorcycle stuff, but he built an LS engine for something, and he showed me the technique of how to do this. So credit where credit's due. If you wanna see how he did it with a garden sprayer instead of a prior bleeder like this, watch his video. Well, I ran out of oil, and I still have 2 lifters here that do not have oil on them. I'm not satisfied with that, so I'm gonna go ahead and throw the other 3 quarts in here and keep on trucking. All right, the last rocker has got oil coming out of it. That means all the lifters are now pumped up and have oil. This thing is ready to fire for the first time. So I'm gonna let this push down as much more oil as it can into the system, and then I'll just pour the rest down the filler neck, and she is ready to go for the first fire up. And there you have it. The engine for the Crewman is more or less complete. Now you'll see some new things that have been added to it here. I put the engine harness on. I had to do that because I had to connect the crank position sensor plug before I could put the starter on, or I would have no access to get it on. You'll see also I have a brand new gold blade throttle body for the intake manifold. I'd love to say the intake manifold is connected to the engine right now, but it's just kind of floating on there. I still need to use that lift plate that I bought in order to install the engine in the Crewman when that time comes, and then I will bolt the intake on. But I've got my brand new serpentine belts installed and everything is set, and I've got an air conditioning belt on too. All I have to do now is test the starter to make sure it works good before I go ahead and drop the engine in the car. So let's give this a try. That works pretty darn good. I'm so excited. I built another engine, this one completely from scratch, which was very exciting, but it sounds pretty darn good, and I cannot wait for the day that I've actually got this thing in the Crewman and it comes to life for the very first time. So that is gonna wrap up this episode of Josh's Car Corner. Thank you so much for watching this point all the way through Project Crewman. There will be more episodes soon. See you in the next one.